Wow, that's a pretty big tree right there. Well, this tree here that's so large, it kind of tells me that the forest growing up behind me right here is what we'd call an old growth forest. One that's been growing for a really long time and hasn't been disturbed in a while. Now, what is a disturbance if you're in the forest? Well, a disturbance is something that resets the forest, basically. It takes out a lot of the old trees that are growing there and allows new stuff to come in. Something like a forest fire, for example. Or perhaps it's an area that has never had forest at all, but is going to start growing one. How do trees get into these places that are just open ground for them? Well, today we're in Western Washington and we're going to look at a tree that has a really easy job coming into areas that have been destroyed by fire or moving into new ground. And we're going to take a look at that tree in its natural habitat and some of the adaptations it has that help it be so successful. Today we're going to be looking at a tree called the paper birch tree. Now, how to identify this tree if you do come across it growing out in the forest? Well, the first thing that a lot of people know about birch trees is that birches have really distinctive bark. Now, it's no coincidence that the words book and birch and bark all have very similar sounds. They all come from the same root word, and part of the reason for that, especially with the paper birch here, is that birch bark peels away from the tree. It's very smooth, a very light white color, usually on the outside, and it'll peel off in kind of thin strips that are really conducive to writing on. In fact, in historical times, people have written on birch bark as a way of communicating and storing records. Now, that birch bark that's so nice and white and smooth is also going to be kind of shot through with these horizontal lines along the trunk of the tree. Those horizontal lines are called lenticels, and they're little cracks in the tree that allow air to get in effectively so that the tree can kind of breathe. Trees need oxygen too in order to get back stored energy, just like you and I do. Now, if you can't identify the birch just from the bark, you might want to take a look at some of the leaves. Here in Western Washington, where I'm filming today, there often aren't that many deciduous trees or trees that'll lose their leaves in the wintertime, but the paper birch is one of those trees. In the fall, it'll get this beautiful kind of golden yellow color, and the leaves are going to be kind of an oval shape, but they're going to taper to a very sharp point at one end. They're also going to have serrations on the side, which are going to kind of look like small teeth. The only tree that's really easy to confuse it with here in Washington State is its cousin, the red alder tree, but the teeth on the paper birch are going to be a little bit sharper. Now, if you're going to some of the more eastern parts of this tree's range, there's actually going to be other types of birch trees, and I encourage you to bring along a guidebook to be able to tell this one apart from some of its nearby neighbors. Now let's take a chance to get out in the forest and learn a little bit about the history and ecology of this tree. I'm now out here in the forest with my friend, the paper birch tree. Now, since this tree is such a gorgeous tree, you're probably wondering where you can find it. And paper birches are actually special for having one of the broadest geographic ranges that you can find of any tree here in North America. Now, this tree right now that I am with is in northwestern Washington, but in fact, they grow all the way up into Canada, right up to the edge of the tundra where it's too harsh for any trees to grow. And they grow all the way across Canada into Maine, into the northern parts of the Midwest, and right down into the Northeast as well. A really common tree across that huge swath of the continent. Quite incredible. So how might our friend the paper birch here get that really broad range across a whole huge swath of the country? Well, if you're a plant, one way to ensure that you can grow across a wide range of places is to evolve yourself to be really good at surviving as an early successional species. Now, what does that mean? An early successional species is a type of life forms, in this case plants, that grow really well after a disturbance, something like a fire or a flood, or even longer term, something like an ice age where big glaciers come sweeping across the landscape and wipe out all of the life that was there before. Now, living in a place where all of the life has been taken out by a disturbance has some advantages. If you're a tree and you're growing on a bare patch of soil, you don't have to worry about competing for sunlight. You also don't have to worry about competing for resources under the soil. A whole lot of good reasons to be the first one on the scene and growing. Now, there's a difficulty with that because, of course, trees, they can't walk very well because they're rooted in place. So how does the paper birch tree get on that scene in a place after a disturbance? So for the paper birch tree coming onto the scene after a disturbance, it's actually really simple. See this bark here peeling off the tree? It's like the sails of an ancient sailing ship, and the trees just sail across the landscape to new places and grow. What do you mean I can't just make that up? Okay, so paper birches don't actually sail across the landscape, although wind is involved in their dispersal or the spreading of their seeds. See, what happens is that paper birches, they have these really small little seeds that you'll find in the female catkins, and those catkins will break apart, and these seeds are actually attached to these things called bracts. So they're specialized leaves that have evolved to have a different function than just making energy for the tree. And these specialized leaves that are attached to the seeds are kind of like wings, and their function is to pick up birch seeds and fly them off to new places. And this system actually turns out to work really, really well for the paper birch. They release millions of seeds onto the wind, and those seeds are picked up, and even if they just fly a couple of 100 meters, that's still much further than we could hope for from the seed just dropping from the tree straight onto the ground. And in fact, this process works so well that in some places of the world, birch forests are expanding really rapidly. Now, those places are usually the northernmost ranges of any trees in the world, up towards the tundra, up in Canada and across northern Europe as well as into Russia and northern Asia. And the reason for that is as the planet warms with global warming, places that used to be too cold for trees to grow are suddenly warm enough for trees to grow. And our paper birch here, with their early successional method of spreading their seeds on the wind, has an advantage in growing into new forests in these places. Being wind dispersed as an early successional species is actually only part of the full story for the paper birch. And I'm sitting here with a clump of paper birches that are all growing from the same place. It's almost as if they're attached by the roots. That probably didn't come about from a seed. Well, we're going to learn about a second thing that the paper birch has evolved to do that allows it to be a great early succession species. So we've learned how coming in with very small, easily wind-blown seeds allows the paper birch to be a really successful early succession species, one of the trees that comes back first after a disturbance in an ecosystem. But there's some drawbacks to growing up from a seed. For one thing, if you want your seeds to move a long distance, they have to be pretty small, which means they can't carry much nutrients. That means a lot of them are going to die. It would be much easier for a tree to be able to grow if it had a whole bunch of energy stashed away. And for the next bit of this video, we need to think about what you can't see with trees. Now, everybody, of course, has seen a tree from the ground up, but what about what's beneath the soil there? Now, the second secret to birches being able to be an early succession species surviving in places of disturbance has to do with their root systems. Now, how it works is, in the case of a fire, like the one behind me here on Sourdough Mountain in North Cascades National Park, there's a good chance that fire is going to go through and kill some of the trees that it's burning right now, and that's okay. Fire is a natural part of the ecosystem. This one behind me was started by a lightning strike. But of course, the trees themselves, they don't necessarily want to be dead. The paper birch, unfortunately, has some pretty flammable wood. Its bark is packed with these nice waxy substances that light right up, which means that the trunk of that tree is going to burn along with everything else going there. Now, the trick with this tree, though, is that in those roots, it has a lot of stem cells, and it's able to actually shoot up new growth from the roots, even if the top of the old tree has been completely burned away. That allows the paper birch to grow back rapidly after fire from existing root systems. The same tree, the same genetic material, just different trunks. And you can tell this when you look at a grove of paper birches and you find a whole bunch of trunks growing out of one space in the ground rather than just a single trunk. That's a good indication that this tree is practicing its second method of succession survival and using its ability to grow back from the roots to survive something like fire. Now there is one problem that comes with evolving your lifestyle to depend on disturbances in order to get your foothold in the ecosystem. So if you're someone who relies on fire to clear out the forest and allow you to grow, for example, that means that if there aren't fires for a while, you might find your place of dominance in the ecosystem disappearing. And that is actually something that here on the shores of Lake Diablo, where I'm filming this today, we're actually seeing a change in the forest makeup. See, about 100 years ago, a lot of the slopes around me were completely covered with open deciduous forest. Deciduous trees, kind of like the paper birch here, and those trees were growing there because just before that time, there had been a large forest fire that had cleared out a lot of the evergreen conifers that now dominate the region once again. As those conifers get bigger, they actually get taller than my friend the paper birch here and cut off the sunlight that keeps this tree alive. Now, the good news is that since fire is a natural part of the ecosystem, there's a good chance that in other places right now, fires are clearing out new space for the paper birches to grow, even if these ones here probably won't make it much longer, unless of course a fire comes through this place as well. Hi everybody. If you enjoy learning about trees and you want to help this page grow a little bit, you can get the chance to learn about a lot more trees and help this page grow by subscribing to this channel. Thank you so much.